The Strait of Hormuz is 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, which is not very wide for a body of water that carries 20% of the world's petroleum and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas through it every year. Before February 28, 2026, approximately 3,000 vessels use the strait every month. A constant procession of supertankers and LNG carriers and container ships and product tankers moving in two lanes through a channel so narrow that sailors on one ship can sometimes see the crew on the vessel sailing in the opposite direction. In the weeks before the United States and Israel launched their air war against Iran on February 28th, cargo ships and tankers were already beginning to cluster at the edges of the strait, visible on marine traffic websites as a dense constellation of dots off the coast of Fujairah in the northern Emirates, because the people who move oil and gas for a living had been watching the signals coming from Washington and Tel Aviv and Tehran, and had concluded, days before any government made an official announcement, that something was about to happen in the region that would make the strait a dangerous place to be. They were right. By March 1st, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had come essentially to a halt. By the time two Chinese supertankers carrying approximately 4 million barrels of Iraqi crude exited the strait on Wednesday, May 20th, 2026, they were among only a handful of vessels that had managed to transit the waterway in nearly 3 months, passing through a channel that had previously handled 3,000 ships a month and that now handled, according to the House of Commons Library research briefing published on Tuesday, traffic at approximately 5% of its pre-conflict level. Those two Chinese tankers became a news story not because two ships leaving a strait is ordinarily newsworthy, but because in the context of the worst disruption to global energy supplies in the history of modern oil markets, the movement of two ships through 39 kilometers of contested water was the closest thing to hope that a watching world had seen in weeks. The war that produced this situation began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran. The opening strikes were devastating in their precision and their ambition. They assassinated Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, the 86-year-old cleric who had led the Islamic Republic since 1989, and whose death represented the decapitation of the institution around which the entire apparatus of Iranian state power had been organized for more than 3 decades. They struck Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure across the country. They hit the facilities of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the parallel military organization that controls Iran's missile and drone arsenals and its network of regional proxies from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. The first weeks of the war killed thousands of people in Iran and Lebanon, and dozens more in Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And the damage to Iranian military infrastructure was described by Trump in a 4-minute televised address as a spectacular military success. Iran's response was to do the one thing that its military planners had always said it would do if it believed its survival was at stake, which was to close the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait. It boarded and attacked merchant ships. It laid sea mines in the narrow channel. It fired on vessels that attempted to transit without authorization. A tugboat was sunk. At least 17 merchant ships were damaged, 7 of them abandoned by their crews. And hundreds of tankers that had been in the Gulf when the IRGC closed the strait found themselves unable to leave, their cargoes sitting in the heat and the tension, while oil traders and shipping companies and governments on 5 continents watched their screens and tried to calculate what the closure meant for prices, for supply chains, for the economies of every country on Earth that runs on oil and gas, which is to say, every country on Earth. The answer to that calculation was immediate and brutal. Oil prices surged from approximately $70 a barrel just before the war to an average of $103 a barrel in March, an increase of nearly 50% in a matter of weeks. Gasoline prices in the United States rose sharply. In parts of Asia east of the Gulf, where countries rely heavily on oil supplied through the Strait of Hormuz, fuel shortages emerged and rationing was imposed in some places. Major oil-producing states in the Gulf that depend on the strait to move their exports were forced to cut or suspend production because their terminal infrastructure had been damaged by Iranian missile and drone attacks, or because insurance companies were refusing to cover tankers operating in the region at any price that made commercial sense. Iraq, whose oil exports move almost entirely through Gulf terminals and out through the Hormuz, was particularly hard hit, which is why the 2 supertankers that exited the strait on May 20th were carrying Iraqi crude rather than Iranian or Saudi oil. They were among a handful of vessels that had managed to arrange passage through the narrow lanes that the combined U.S. naval blockade and Iranian IRGC enforcement had left available, carrying cargo that Iraq desperately needed to export to keep its own economy functioning. The United States responded to the Iranian closure by imposing its own counter-blockade on April 13th, preventing ships that had docked at Iranian ports from passing through the strait, a measure designed to compound the economic pressure on Tehran by preventing not just the export of Iranian oil, but also the import of staple goods that the Iranian population depends on. Iran's storage capacity for oil exports was projected to reach its limit in May, potentially forcing production reductions that would further damage the regime's revenues and its ability to fund the military operations that the IRGC was conducting in the Strait and across the region. The combination of the Iranian closure, the U.S. counter-blockade, and the departure of commercial shipping from the region created what the House of Commons Library described as a dual blockade, a situation in which neither side was able to move goods through the world's most strategically important maritime choke point without the other side's cooperation. And both sides were using the economic pain of that blockade as leverage in negotiations that were being conducted through Pakistani intermediaries and through Omani back channels and through whatever other diplomatic pathways remained open between Washington and Tehran to reach an agreement that would end the conflict on terms both sides could accept. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves in an attempt to offset some of the price impact of the Hormuz closure, the largest coordinated release in the agency's history. Russia, whose oil exports do not travel through the Strait of Hormuz, found itself the beneficiary of an extraordinary windfall, with the average increase in its oil revenues from higher prices calculated at approximately $150 million per day in March alone, which is a remarkable amount of money being transferred to the budget of a country that was simultaneously conducting the largest aerial bombardment campaign in the history of modern warfare against Ukrainian cities. Iran itself, despite the conflict, also temporarily benefited from the price surge, with average daily oil revenue increases of approximately $25 million before the U.S. counter-blockade began cutting into the regime's ability to move its oil to buyers. The war created economic winners and losers in patterns that did not always align with the political and military alignments of the conflict, which is one of the reasons why the diplomatic pressure to reach a settlement was coming not just from the United States and Iran, but from governments across Asia and Europe and the Middle East that were experiencing the economic consequences of a conflict that neither they nor their populations had any role in starting. Trump said on Tuesday, May 19th, that the war would be over very quickly. He said this at the White House, while also saying that he had paused a planned resumption of hostilities against Iran following a new proposal from Tehran to end the conflict. The pausing of a planned attack on Iran was itself a story, because the day before he made this statement, Trump had told reporters at the White House that he had been an hour away from making the decision to go, meaning an hour away from ordering a new wave of American strikes on Iranian targets, before pulling back after receiving Iran's new peace proposal. The sequence of events that Trump described, an attack planned, an Iranian proposal received, an attack paused, a statement that the war would be over very quickly, is the compressed and volatile diplomatic narrative of a conflict that has been moving between escalation and negotiation and back again for nearly 3 months, with each swing of that pendulum having immediate and measurable consequences for the price of oil and the movement of tankers through a 39-kilometer channel in the Gulf. J.D. Vance, speaking at a White House press briefing on the same day that shipping data confirmed the 2 Chinese tankers had exited the Strait, said that the United States was in a pretty good spot in its negotiations with Iran. He said that the U.S. was trying to make its own red lines clear in the talks, acknowledging that the fractured nature of Iranian leadership since Khamenei's assassination had made it difficult to identify a coherent negotiating position on the other side of the table. He said, with a careful phrasing of someone who has been watching a negotiation go sideways before and does not want to overpromise, that it is not sometimes totally clear what the negotiating position of the team is, meaning the Iranian team, and that the United States was therefore focusing on communicating its own requirements clearly, rather than trying to parse exactly what the various factions within the post-Khamenei Iranian power structure wanted. He said that one objective of Trump's policy was to prevent a nuclear arms race from spreading in the region, which was a reference to the fact that the strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities had been a central objective of the military campaign, and that the agreement being negotiated would need to include verifiable commitments from Iran not to rebuild the enrichment capacity that the strikes had destroyed. Iran's response to the diplomatic signals from Washington on Tuesday was delivered through Ebrahim Azizi, the head of the Iranian Parliament's National Security Committee, who posted on the social media platform X that Trump's pausing of the planned attack was due to the realization that any move against Iran would mean facing a decisive military response. This is the language of a government that is trying simultaneously to negotiate a settlement and to maintain a posture of deterrence for its domestic audience, a contradiction that is built into the position of any government that is losing a war on the military dimension while still needing to present itself to its own population as unbowed and capable of resistance. Iranian state media said that Tehran's latest peace proposal involved ending hostilities on all fronts, which was understood to mean not just the direct U.S.-Iranian military confrontation, but also the Iranian-backed proxy groups in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Lebanon that had been attacking American military assets and Gulf state targets throughout the conflict. The proposal was being mediated through Pakistan, which had established itself as the primary back channel between Washington and Tehran, with Pakistani officials traveling between the two capitals and carrying messages in both directions in a process that had been ongoing for weeks, before the May 20th signal suggested it might be reaching a conclusion. The movement of the two Chinese tankers on May 20th was significant, not just as a signal about the diplomatic trajectory of the conflict, but as a piece of data about what is actually happening inside the strait on a day-to-day basis. The tankers were among a handful of supertankers carrying Iraqi crude that had managed to exit the Gulf during May, according to data from LSEG and Kepler, two of the primary shipping data tracking organizations that have been following traffic through the strait since the closure began. The combined cargo of the two ships, approximately 4 million barrels of crude, is a significant quantity of oil in the sense that it represents the daily consumption of several major economies. But it is a small fraction of the flow that the strait was handling before February 28th, when 3,000 vessels a month were transiting without difficulty, and 20% of global petroleum was moving through the channel as a routine commercial matter. The fact that the movement of two ships through the strait was treated as significant news was reported by Reuters and AFP and the BBC, and every major oil market publication within hours of the shipping data appearing, tells you something precise and sobering about how completely the closure of the Hormuz has changed the calculus of global energy supply. Before the war, no one wrote news stories about individual tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. After nearly 3 months of the worst disruption to global energy supplies in the history of modern oil markets, two ships making it through becomes a headline. Oil prices responded to the combination of the shipping data and the diplomatic signals from the White House in the way that oil prices respond to any information that suggests the Hormuz might be reopening sooner rather than later, which is to fall. Brent crude dropped to as low as $110.16 a barrel on Wednesday, following the positive signals, down from the peaks that the conflict had produced in March and April, though still substantially above the roughly $70 a barrel that crude had been trading at just before the war began. The fall in prices on Wednesday was a market judgment that the probability of a deal had increased meaningfully, not that a deal had been reached. And the gap between those two things is important because the history of the negotiations over the previous weeks had been one of signals followed by reversals, followed by new signals, with Trump himself describing on Tuesday that he had been an hour away from ordering a new wave of strikes before pulling back. Oil markets that have been trading on the news flow of the Hormuz negotiations for nearly 3 months have learned to treat positive signals from the White House as reasons to reduce the risk premium rather than reasons to eliminate it, because the deal that would definitively reopen the strait has not yet been signed, and the history of this particular negotiation suggests that it could easily not be signed for weeks or months more. The Trump administration's political motivations for reaching a deal were described openly in multiple press reports on Wednesday, and they are worth understanding clearly because they explain why Trump was willing to pause a planned attack on Iran rather than proceeding with it, even though he had publicly committed to extensive strikes if shipping did not resume through the strait. Trump is under intense political pressure at home to reach an agreement that would reopen the Hormuz and bring gasoline prices down. His approval rating had fallen significantly since the conflict began, with the economic impact of high fuel prices registering in the domestic polling that an administration with congressional elections approaching in November cannot afford to ignore. The political calculus is direct, and Trump himself acknowledged it by saying that Iran's leaders are begging for a deal, a statement that served to reframe the pause in military action as a position of strength rather than accommodation, allowing him to present the diplomatic engagement as Iran coming to him rather than him backing down from a commitment. Whether Iran's leaders are in fact begging for a deal, or whether they are making the minimum concessions necessary to avoid further military strikes while preserving as much of their position as possible, is a question that the fractured post-Khamenei Iranian leadership structure makes genuinely difficult to answer from outside the negotiations, which is precisely what Vance was acknowledging when he said that the U.S. was trying to make its own red lines clear because it was not always clear what the Iranian negotiating position actually was. The Senate, meanwhile, advanced a bill on Monday, May 19th, aimed at ending the Iran war, a reflection of the domestic political pressure that lawmakers in both parties were feeling from constituents experiencing high gasoline prices and from financial markets that had been rattled by 3 months of energy supply disruption. The bill's advancement through the Senate marked a significant moment in the domestic political debate about the conflict because it represented a formal legislative assertion that Congress had a role in determining whether and how the war continued, an assertion that the Trump administration had not welcomed and that the bill's supporters had been building toward through months of increasing unease about the war's economic costs and its diplomatic trajectory. The senator who had been a decisive vote in advancing the bill, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, had recently lost a Republican primary and was therefore freed from the political constraints that had previously made him reluctant to break with the administration on a foreign policy matter that Trump had defined as central to his presidency. Pakistan's role as the primary mediator in the talks deserves attention because it represents one of the more unexpected diplomatic alignments to emerge from the conflict. Pakistan has no obvious institutional connection to the negotiations between the United States and Iran, but it has relationships with both governments that most other potential mediators lack, and its willingness to carry messages between Washington and Tehran has given it a role in one of the most consequential diplomatic processes of 2026 that its own foreign policy establishment could not have anticipated when the year began. The Iranian proposal that Trump described on Tuesday as the new proposal that had led him to pause the planned attack was understood to have been transmitted through Pakistani channels, and the continuing process of clarifying what exactly Iran was proposing and what the United States was requiring was being managed through the same back channel that Pakistan had established in the weeks following the outbreak of hostilities. The two Chinese supertankers that exited the Strait of Hormuz on May 20th carried approximately 4 million barrels of Iraqi crude through a channel that, before February 28th, had handled the equivalent of those 4 million barrels every few hours without generating a single news headline. The ships passed through the 39-kilometer strait under conditions that, before the war, would have been considered routine, and that under the conditions of May 2026 were anything but navigating a waterway that had been mined and patrolled and blockaded and fought over for nearly 3 months. Watched by the tracking systems of every major oil market participant and government intelligence service simultaneously, their passage registered within hours by LSAG and K-Peeler and Reuters and AFP and every other organization that had been monitoring the strait since the closure began. Trump said the war would be over very quickly. Vance said the United States was in a pretty good spot. Oil prices fell to $110 a barrel and then recovered some of their losses. The Senate advanced a bill. Pakistan continued to carry messages. Iran said any new American attack would face a decisive military response. And the two ships moved through the strait and out into the Gulf of Oman and onward toward wherever 4 million barrels of Iraqi crude was going, carrying with them a signal that the watching world decided, at least for Wednesday, to treat as hope. The broader strategic picture in which the Hormuz negotiations are taking place in May 2026 is not one that resolves neatly into a story of American victory or Iranian defeat, even though the military campaign that the United States and Israel launched on February 28th inflicted enormous damage on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure and killed the supreme leader who had defined the Islamic Republic's foreign policy for more than 3 decades. The death of Khamenei did not produce a unified successor willing and able to make binding commitments on behalf of the Iranian state, which is precisely the complication that Vance was describing when he said it is not always totally clear what the negotiating position of the Iranian team is. Iran's power structure after Khamenei's assassination has been divided between military commanders in the IRGC, who believe that any agreement with Washington that does not preserve the core of Iran's deterrent capabilities represents a capitulation that would end in the regime's eventual collapse, and pragmatists within the remaining civilian leadership who believe that the economic damage being inflicted by the dual blockade is severe enough to threaten the regime's survival more immediately than any agreement could. Neither faction has the unilateral authority to make a binding decision, which means that the proposals coming through the Pakistani back channel represent internal Iranian compromises rather than authoritative commitments, and that the United States, as Vance acknowledged, is trying to make its own red line sufficiently clear that any Iranian faction that can make decisions knows what it would be agreeing to. The Brent crude price movement on Wednesday, falling to $110.16 a barrel before recovering some of those losses, encapsulates the fundamental uncertainty that markets have been pricing throughout the conflict. The price before the war was approximately $70 a barrel. The price in March averaged approximately $103 as the initial shock of the closure hit the markets. The price on Wednesday, May 20th, at $110, reflects the accumulated months of disruption to global supply, the release of 400 million barrels of strategic reserves by IEA member countries, the gradual adjustment of supply chains as producers outside the Gulf increased output to partially offset the reduction in Gulf flows, and the ongoing uncertainty about whether the Hormuz will reopen in days or weeks or months. Every time Trump signals that a deal is close, the price falls. Every time an Iranian official issues a statement about decisive military responses, the price rises. Every time 2 Chinese supertankers manage to transit the strait without being fired on, the price registers a movement. The market is functioning as a real-time collective judgment about the probability of various futures for a waterway that 20% of the world's petroleum depends on, and the volatility of that judgment is itself a measure of how completely the Hormuz closure has disrupted the assumptions on which global energy markets had been operating. The UAE's experience of the conflict illustrates the cost that America's Gulf partners have been paying for a war they did not choose and cannot control. The UAE's defense ministry reported 3 people wounded after its air defenses engaged ballistic missiles and drones launched by Iran. The UAE's image as a Middle Eastern haven for business and investment, built over decades of deliberate policy choices to position Dubai and Abu Dhabi as stable, neutral ground for international commerce, was being tested by the conflict in ways that its leadership had been desperately trying to manage since February 28th. Iranian missile and drone attacks on UAE territory were precisely the scenario that Emirati planners had been most afraid of, because the UAE depends more than almost any other country on its reputation for safety and predictability to attract the foreign investment and business activity that its economic model requires. The conflict put the UAE in the position of being attacked by Iran because of its relationship with the United States and Israel, which it had not chosen and could not easily escape, while simultaneously being dependent on the resolution of a conflict it had no direct means of influencing. Gulf officials, according to reports, had urged the United States not to proceed with further attacks on Iran in the days before Trump said he had paused a planned strike, the latest in a series of similar interventions by Gulf governments who wanted the conflict resolved through negotiation rather than continued military escalation. What the movement of 2 Chinese tankers through the Strait of Hormuz on May 20th actually means for the prospects of a deal depends entirely on what happens in the days that follow. And the recent history of this conflict does not strongly support optimism about the durability of any given positive signal. Trump said on Tuesday he had been an hour away from ordering new strikes. He said on the same day that the war would be over very quickly. Both of these statements are true, and they are also in tension with each other in ways that describe the fundamental volatility of the moment. A president who was an hour away from ordering a new military strike on Iran is not a president who has decided that diplomacy has definitively succeeded. A negotiation in which the opposing side's decision-making structure is, in the words of the American vice president, not always totally clear, is not a negotiation that is close to being finalized. A strait that is at 5% of its pre-conflict traffic volume is not a strait that is reopening. 2 ships made it through on Wednesday. 3,000 were going through every month before February 28th. The distance between 2 ships and 3,000 ships is the distance between a signal and a resolution. And the watching world, which has been trading that distance in oil futures contracts and shipping insurance premiums and gasoline prices for 3 months, is not yet in a position to know how much of it remains to be crossed. The specific numbers that define this crisis deserve to be held in mind alongside everything else, because they give the abstractions of geopolitics and diplomacy a concrete weight that is easy to lose in the language of negotiations and signals and red lines. 20% of global petroleum, 20% of global LNG, 3,000 vessels per month before the war, 5% of that level now, 4 million barrels carried by 2 supertankers on one Wednesday in May, $110 per barrel, down from 103 in March but up from 70 before the war. 400 million barrels released from strategic reserves, $150 million per day in additional Russian oil revenues from higher prices. 12 seafarers killed or missing, 7 ships abandoned at sea by their crews. And 39 kilometers, the width of the strait at its narrowest point, through which all of this flows or does not flow depending on decisions being made in Washington and Tehran and Islamabad and the Gulf capitals by people trying to navigate a crisis that has no clean exit and no obvious endpoint. And that began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel decided that the moment had come to resolve by force a set of problems that decades of diplomacy had failed to resolve any other way. 2 Chinese tankers exited the strait on Wednesday. Trump said the war would be over very quickly. The price of Brent crude fell and then recovered, and the world kept watching.